For 6 years, Detective Sergeant Priya Mehta kept a photograph pinned to the corkboard above her desk. It was a school portrait, the kind with the slightly too blue background and the stiff, reluctant smile of a kid who doesn't quite know where to put his hands. The boy in the photograph was named Marcus Feld. He was 19 years old when the picture was taken. He was 23 when Priya arrested him for the murder of Celeste Oduya, and for 6 years after that, she told herself she had done the right thing. She was wrong. And the man who knew she was wrong, the man who had always known, had been sitting across from her at the conference table every single Tuesday for 5 of those 6 years. He had a thermos of black coffee. He had a yellow legal pad. He had a soft, careful voice that Priya had come to think of as kind. His name was Darian Osei Mensah. He was a forensic psychologist with 14 years of credentials, 3 published books, and a professional reputation that made detectives across 2 counties feel lucky to have him on their side. He was also the one who killed Celeste. To understand how this happened, how an entire city's homicide apparatus could be steered in the wrong direction for 6 years by a man whose job was to help it find the right one, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to October 14th, 11 years ago now. Back to a small town called Millhaven, in a river valley in western Pennsylvania, where autumn comes early and hard and the morning fog sits low over the water until nearly noon, and the leaves turn so fast it almost looks like something is on fire. Celeste Oduya was 26 years old. She was a second-year teacher at Millhaven Middle School, 7th grade English. And by every account, she was exactly the kind of teacher that children remember their whole lives. She was specific in her praise. She noticed things. She had a habit, when a student's essay surprised her, of writing in the margin rather than at the bottom, not a grade but a response, like a conversation she wanted to continue. A former student interviewed years later for a profile piece in a regional newspaper said that Celeste had once written in the margin of her essay, in red ink, "This sentence is doing more work than it knows." The student said she kept the essay, said she framed it, said she looked at it sometimes when she felt like she wasn't enough. Celeste had moved to Millhaven 2 years before her death, following a teaching position she'd applied for on a whim during a period of transition. She'd recently ended a long-term relationship and wanted a change of geography. She rented half of a duplex on the east side of town with a woman named Janelle Fortis, who worked in HR at a regional bank. By all accounts, she and Janelle had become close quickly, the particular closeness that forms between 2 people in their mid-20s who are both, in their own quiet ways, figuring out who they want to be. Janelle said later that Celeste was the kind of person who made a place feel like home, that she had a gift for small ceremonies, Sunday morning coffee with particular rituals, a specific playlist for cooking dinner, the way she'd arrange things on the windowsill. She made the ordinary feel chosen, Janelle said. Like every small thing was worth doing on purpose. On the night of October 14th, Celeste left the school at approximately 7:20 in the evening. She had stayed late to set up a bulletin board display for a poetry unit she was beginning the following week. The display was never finished. It was found the next morning exactly as she had left it, half assembled, the unmounted pages of student poems still stacked in a neat pile on the table beneath the blank board. A custodian named Walt Brzezinyak saw her in the 3rd-floor hallway at around 7:15. He said she had her coat on and her tote bag over one shoulder and was walking toward the stairs with the slightly hurried pace of someone who'd been staying later than intended. He said she saw him and waved. He said she looked fine. He said he thought about that wave a great deal afterward. He said it was a specific wave, not a quick flick of the hand, but a full, open-palmed gesture, like she meant it. He said he waved back. He said he wished he'd said something. He didn't know what he would have said. He just wished he had. She drove herself home along her usual route, Route 9 south through the center of town, then right on Birch Creek Road, a 12-minute drive she had made hundreds of times. That was the last confirmed sighting of Celeste Oduya alive. Her roommate, Janelle Fortis, reported her missing the next morning when she hadn't come home that night and hadn't appeared for school by 8:15, which had never once happened in the 2 years they'd lived together. Janelle described herself as a worrier by nature, prone to checking, prone to calling when she hadn't heard back. She said she had called Celeste's phone 3 times after 10 p.m. and gotten voicemail each time. She said she tried to convince herself there was an explanation. She said she couldn't. She said she knew, in the particular way that you know certain things, that something was wrong. She said it was the way the apartment felt when she got home that evening. Too quiet, too settled, the way a room feels when it has been empty for a very long time rather than just a few hours. Like the absence had weight. Celeste's car was found at 6:40 a.m. on October 15th, parked on the gravel pull-off beside Birch Creek itself, approximately half a mile from the apartment building. The engine was off. The keys were in the ignition. Her tote bag was in the back seat, her wallet inside it, $34 in cash and 2 credit cards untouched. Her phone was on the passenger seat, screen down, battery at 11%. There was no sign of a struggle. No broken glass, no damage, no drag marks in the gravel. Nothing out of place. Nothing, that is, except the absence of Celeste. Her body was recovered from the creek 3 days later, approximately 2 miles downstream from where the car was found. The Millhaven County medical examiner, Dr. Sandra Kwan, determined the cause of death to be homicidal drowning. There was evidence of blunt force trauma to the back of the head, consistent, she said in her report, with a single deliberate strike from a heavy, smooth-surfaced object. A rock, most likely, given the creek's composition and the particular topography of the bank. Dr. Kwan was careful with her language in the report. She did not speculate beyond what the evidence allowed. But she said in her testimony, nearly a year later, that the blow had been precise, delivered to a specific location on the skull, at a specific angle, with a force calibrated, her word, to incapacitate rather than to kill immediately. This was not a frenzied attack, she said. This was controlled. She also noted, in the original examination report, something that would become extraordinarily significant much later, a trace of synthetic rubber compound on Celeste's right wrist. A thin smear, consistent with the exterior surface of a laboratory or examination glove, the kind used in clinical or forensic settings. It was documented. It was cross-referenced against nothing in particular. It went into the file and was not examined again for nearly 7 years. The investigation was formally assigned to the Millhaven County Sheriff's Office, with assistance requested from the Pennsylvania State Police within 48 hours, when it became apparent that the Sheriff's Department lacked the resources and the experience for a homicide investigation of this complexity. The state police sent 2 detectives. One was named Carl Andover, a 20-year veteran who would retire 2 years later and who would say, privately, that the Oduya case was the one he should have handled differently. The other was Priya Mehta. Priya was 31 years old at the time. She had been with the state police for 7 years, worked 3 prior homicides, and had developed a reputation that her supervisors described with a specific word: thorough. She was the detective who read every document twice, who went back to speak to witnesses a second and third time, not because she didn't trust them, but because she believed that people remembered things differently when they'd had time to stop being frightened. Who kept a physical case wall at home, mirrored after the one at the office because she thought better with her hands, arranging and rearranging the photographs and the timelines until the shape of the thing revealed itself. She arrived in Millhaven on October 19th, 5 days after Celeste was last seen. She went first to the creek. She stood at the pull-off where the car had been found and looked at the water for a long time. Then she started talking to people. She talked to Celeste's colleagues at the school, the principal, the other English teacher, the vice principal who had worked with Celeste on a curriculum committee and who described her as deeply conscientious, the kind of person who did the unglamorous work without being asked. She talked to Janelle, who was struggling badly and who held a box of tissues in her lap throughout the entire interview. She talked to Walt, who told her about the wave. She talked to parents of students, to neighbors, to the woman who owned the diner on Main Street, where Celeste ate breakfast most Saturdays. A woman named Opal, who remembered that Celeste always ordered the same thing: 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, black coffee, and always left a generous tip, and always thanked the servers by name. She remembered their names, Opal said. That doesn't sound like much, but it means something. Priya talked to 47 people in the first 2 weeks. She documented everything. She was building a picture, Not of the crime, not yet, but of the life, of the person, of the shape that Celeste had left in the world, the negative space that her absence now occupied. And then, on the 8th day of the investigation, she talked to Marcus Feld. Marcus Feld was 23 years old. He had grown up in Millhaven, dropped out of community college after one semester, and was working part-time at a gas station on Route 9 and picking up odd jobs as needed. He lived in a 2-room apartment in a building 3 streets over from Birch Creek Road. He was quiet, his neighbors said. Kept to himself mostly. Had a girlfriend named Ashley who he'd been with for 2 years. Had a close friend, Dion, who he played basketball with on weekends. No criminal record, no history of violence, no particular anything really. The connection to Celeste was tissue thin. Marcus had attended Millhaven Middle School roughly a decade earlier, years before Celeste was hired there, so there was no student-teacher relationship. What investigators found was this: in the summer 2 years before the murder, Celeste had briefly helped coach an adult co-ed softball league through the town's recreation department, a side project she'd taken on to stay busy and meet people in her new town. Marcus had played in that league for 1 season. They'd been in the same recreational orbit for approximately 6 weeks. Marcus had apparently mentioned Celeste to a friend once, a comment that the friend remembered as something like, "the pretty teacher who helps run softball." The friend passed this information to a county deputy during a canvass interview, framing it offhandedly, not as an accusation. It went into the file as a potential behavioral indicator. It was labeled Marcus Feld, expressed interest in victim. The second piece was the ATM receipt. Marcus had made a cash withdrawal at a gas station ATM on Route 9 at 7:31 p.m. on October 14th, 11 minutes after Walt Brzezinyak last saw Celeste in the school hallway. The gas station was on the same route she would have been driving. Marcus used that ATM regularly. His apartment was nearby. He used Route 9 constantly. He had a withdrawal at that ATM on 11 of the preceding 14 Tuesdays. None of this was in the initial summary report. The summary just said, Marcus Feld, placed on victim's route at time of disappearance. It was enough. The investigation began to develop its center of gravity. Marcus was brought in for a voluntary interview on October 22nd. Priya conducted it herself, with Carl Andover observing. She said later that she went in trying to keep an open posture, that she wasn't going in to confirm a theory, she was going in to gather information. She believed this about herself. It is possible she was right, but she also went in with a file that described Marcus as someone who had expressed interest in the victim and who had been on her route the night she disappeared, and that shapes a room whether you want it to or not. The interview lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Marcus denied any involvement. He said he went to the ATM that night because he needed cash for groceries. He said he drove home after. He said he was home by 8 or a little after. He said he watched TV. He said he was alone. This last part, alone, was where the story developed its fracture because it was a lie. Marcus had not been alone that evening. He had, after a period of evasion and contradiction in the interview, eventually admitted that he couldn't fully account for his evening because he'd rather not say. He said it in almost those exact words. He said he just couldn't get into it. Priya noted this carefully. She noted that he had been evasive about his whereabouts. She noted that the evasion preceded any adversarial pressure. She noted that he seemed nervous throughout, though she also noted in a parenthetical she would later regret, that nervousness is not indicative of guilt in an interview with homicide detectives. She noted it and moved on. The lead it generated was not followed for another 3 weeks. What Marcus was hiding, what he was too ashamed to say in a room with 2 police detectives at a table while his name was being connected to a young woman's murder, was that between approximately 8 p.m. and 11 p.m. on October 14th, he had been at the apartment of a woman named Deja Carmichael. Deja was 25, lived on Elm Street about 4 miles from Birch Creek, and had been seeing Marcus informally for about a month, a situation Marcus had not disclosed to his girlfriend Ashley and did not want to. He was mortified, he was scared, he was 23 years old, and he was making the worst calculation of his life. he decided that being caught cheating was the more immediately terrifying option. Deja Carmichael called the sheriff's office on October 27th, 5 days after Marcus's interview. She had heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd been brought in for questioning. She called to say he had been with her. She left a message with a desk clerk. The message was logged in the incoming contact sheet. There is no record of anyone returning her call. On November 3rd, investigators executed a search warrant on Marcus's apartment. Among the items collected was a pair of work boots, the kind with thick rubber soles and steel toes, bought from a hardware store. A forensic geologist contracted by the state police examined soil samples from the soles and concluded that the composition was consistent with the riverbank soil near the Birch Creek pull-off. The phrase used in the report was strongly consistent. It was not a match, it was consistent. Millhaven sits in a river valley. Birch Creek soil is not unique. But the report said strongly consistent, and that phrase took on a life of its own in the summary documents. Marcus Feld was arrested on November 9th. He was charged with first-degree murder in the death of Celeste Oduya. He wept during booking. He said to the officer processing him, "I didn't do this. I swear on my mother I didn't do this." The officer wrote this down as a denial of guilt. It was not given particular weight. Denials of guilt during booking are routine. The trial convened the following April. It lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution's case was entirely circumstantial. The ATM receipt placing him on the route, the soil on his boots, the second-hand pretty teacher comment reframed as evidence of fixation. The interview inconsistencies framed as consciousness of guilt. The failure to disclose his whereabouts interpreted, in the prosecution's closing, as evidence of a man who knew exactly why he couldn't say where he'd been. The defense presented Deja Carmichael. She was a composed witness. She had thought carefully about what she was going to say, and she said it clearly. Marcus had been at her apartment from approximately 8 to 11 p.m. She knew the time because she had watched the second half of a specific television program that began at 9, and Marcus had arrived before it started. She knew the date because it was her brother's birthday, and she had spoken to him on the phone that afternoon. She had documentation of both. The prosecution attacked her credibility. They implied she was a woman protecting a man she cared about. They noted that she had only come forward after learning he was a suspect. They suggested, without quite saying it, that her account was constructed rather than recalled. She sat in the witness box and said, "I'm telling you the truth. He was with me." 4 days of jury deliberation, second-degree murder, 22 to 30 years. Marcus Feld was 23 years old. He had never been in trouble before. He had an alibi witness. He had no physical evidence connecting him to the scene, only evidence consistent with proximity to a river in a river valley. He had a second-hand comment about finding a woman attractive, retold once, which had become, through the alchemy of the file summary process, a documented history of obsession. He went to prison, and the real killer went home. His name was Darian Osei Mensah, and he arrived at the Millhaven County Sheriff's Office 8 months after Marcus's conviction, on a Wednesday morning in early July, carrying his thermos and his legal pad and a letter of introduction addressed to the sheriff. The letter was impeccable. It laid out his credentials with precision and without boastfulness. A doctorate in clinical and forensic psychology from Carnegie Mellon University, followed by a 2-year fellowship with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. Board certification, 14 years of consulting experience with law enforcement agencies across Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio. 3 published books on criminal psychology, one of which was used as a course text in the forensic science program at 3 regional universities. A list of 15 case references, detectives, district attorneys, a retired federal judge, all available to speak to the quality of his work. He was offering his services, the letter said, because he had followed the Oduya case in the press and found himself with professional questions that the public record hadn't resolved. He thought there might be value, going forward, in a relationship between a forensic psychology consultant and a county that was, by his observation, doing excellent investigative work with limited resources. He asked for nothing in return except the intellectual engagement of working on difficult cases alongside skilled detectives. The sheriff called 2 of the references that week. Both used the same word about Darian, invaluable. He was hired on retainer by the end of July. Priya Mehta met Darian for the first time at the sheriff's office on July 18th. She had remained loosely attached to Millhaven following the conviction. Formally, her assignment had ended, but she found reasons to stay in contact with the department. The open arsons case, a suspicious drowning in a neighboring township. The truth, though she didn't quite name it to herself at the time, was that she hadn't fully let go of the Oduya case. The hum of unease she'd carried through the trial had quieted but never stopped. She told herself it was just the normal residue of a hard case. She had been wrong before. Maybe she was wrong again. She met Darian and thought, this is a person who takes things seriously. She liked him very much, almost immediately. He had a particular quality that she would spend years trying to describe accurately, and the best she could ever do was this. He made you feel like the conversation you were having with him was the most important conversation you'd had all week, and he accomplished this not through performance or flattery, but through genuine attention. He was interested. He retained what you told him. He asked follow-up questions that demonstrated not just that he'd heard you, but that he'd thought about what you'd said after you finished saying it. He had that slight tilt of the head. He had the phrase, "Give me a moment with that," before a considered response. He had the quality, rare and in him almost alchemical, of making careful thinking feel like warmth. They met on Tuesdays, an hour at the sheriff's office, sometimes two. They discussed the arsons, the drowning, a series of stalking complaints that Darian believed, correctly as it turned out, were connected to a single offender operating across 3 zip codes. His insights were consistently useful, sometimes remarkable. He had a gift for what he called behavioral triangulation, finding the intersection point of disparate details that, taken separately, pointed nowhere in particular, but arranged correctly revealed the signature of a specific kind of mind. He could look at a crime scene photograph and describe in careful probabilistic language the emotional state of the perpetrator at the moment of commission. He was careful never to overstate. He qualified everything. He said suggests rather than indicates. He said consistent with rather than proves. He was, in the language of professional epistemics, scrupulous. About twice a year he would circle back to the Oduya case, not dramatically, not with accusation. He would bring it up the way a careful professional raises a concern that has been sitting with him, slowly, with visible reluctance, like a person who is aware that doubt is costly and is choosing to pay the cost anyway because intellectual honesty demands it. He said he wasn't certain Marcus Feld was the right man. He said the behavioral profile of the crime, the staging of the scene, the deliberate repositioning of the personal effects, the choice of water as a disposal site combined with the lack of weighted material, which suggested a preference for scenic cover over permanent concealment, pointed toward a perpetrator with significant behavioral sophistication. Marcus Feld, he said once, refilling his thermos cap with coffee and replacing the cap before he looked up, doesn't read behaviorally as sophisticated. That's not a moral judgment, it's a clinical observation. The crime reads as the work of someone who thinks in systems. Marcus, from the interview record and the behavioral profile, thinks in moments. He would say this, and then he would say that he might be wrong, and then he would move on to the arsons or to whatever was on the legal pad. Priya would sit with it. She would feel the hum. She would look at the photograph of Marcus on her corkboard. She would think about Deja Carmichael on the witness stand, saying clearly and without drama, "I'm telling the truth. He was with me." She did not reopen the case. There was nothing to reopen it with. She had done her job thoroughly. The jury had decided. The appeals had failed. She told herself that doubt was part of the work, that it didn't mean she was wrong, that it definitely didn't mean Darian was right. He was counting on that. He had been counting on it from the beginning. The break came 7 years after Celeste's death, and it came not from a detective or a database or a tip from an informant with something to trade. It came from a 9-year-old boy named Theo. Theo lived with his mother, Lisette Brandt, in a small white house in Wharton Township, about 14 miles north of Millhaven. Lisette was a single parent. Theo's father had left when Theo was 2, and she managed as single parents do, with a tight budget and a longer to-do list than she could ever get to the bottom of. The gutters needed cleaning. The fence in the back had a broken section. The garage door track had been sticking for 18 months. A man she knew as David Park had first appeared in her life about 4 years before Theo found the bag. on a morning after a significant windstorm that had taken down 2 sections of her fence. She came home from work to find a man she didn't recognize replacing the fence posts. He introduced himself as a neighbor helping out. He lived on the next street over, he said, and had noticed the damage. He said he'd had the materials and the time. He said it was no trouble. He said his name was David. He had a pleasant, even manner and a face that did not make an impression. The kind of face that was easy to look at and hard to recall precisely afterward. He refused payment. He waved off thanks. He left. He came back over the following years, 3 or 4 times annually. Never unannounced, he would text first from a number Lisette had saved under David Neighbor. He fixed the garage door track. He cleaned the gutters. He helped clear a fallen tree branch from the backyard after a February ice storm. He was uniformly pleasant, uniformly helpful, and he wanted nothing. He mentioned on one occasion that he worked in mental health services. He did not volunteer more than that, and Lisette did not ask. She was grateful. She was busy. She thought of him as a quiet piece of good fortune. She had no way of knowing that David Park did not exist. She had no way of knowing that the phone number was a burner, replaced every 18 months. She had no way of knowing that she and Theo had been selected, the way a crow selects a cache location for reasons related to access and concealment and the likelihood of disturbance, as an unknowing component of a long-term storage solution. On the afternoon of March 11th, Theo went into the garage to find his bicycle pump, which had migrated from its designated hook by the door to somewhere in the back half of the garage, a region Theo was not technically supposed to be in unsupervised because of the paint cans and the box cutter and the general parental calculus of hazards. He was back there for approximately 4 minutes before he found the bag. It was a canvas duffel, olive green, tucked behind the second shelf of paint cans and partly covered by an old drop cloth that had not been covering it the last time Theo was in the garage. He knew it wasn't theirs. He knew it hadn't been there before. He was 9 years old and had been raised on exactly the kind of television that prepares a child to understand, instinctively, that you do not touch the mysterious bag that shouldn't be there. He looked at it for a long time, then he opened it. Inside, a folded change of clothes, dark colors, unremarkable. A burner phone in a sealed plastic sandwich bag. A laminated card that Theo recognized as the kind of card grown-ups carried in their wallets, with a photograph of a face and a name printed under it, though the name meant nothing to him. And at the very bottom of the bag, wrapped in a cloth that looked like it came from a kitchen, something that Theo recognized immediately from every crime show he had ever watched, because it was the only thing in the world that looks exactly like what it is. A rock, roughly cantaloupe-sized, mottled gray and brown. One edge, not the full surface, just one angled edge, stained a deep, dark, reddish brown. Theo did not touch the rock. He stood very still for a moment, and then he very carefully re-zipped the bag and pushed it back behind the paint cans and put the drop cloth back over it and went to find his mother. Lisette called 911. Wharton Township Police were first on scene. They photographed the bag in situ before touching it. They called the county, who called the state. By 9 p.m. that evening, the bag had been retrieved and transported to the state forensic lab under chain of custody documentation. The rock was processed for biological material. DNA was extracted from the staining on the angled edge. The extraction took 11 days. The comparison ran against the state database and against biological evidence preserved from the Oduya case file. The match came back on April 3rd at 2:17 in the afternoon. The biological material on the rock was Celeste Oduya's. The rock had been striking against the back of a young woman's head on a cold October evening 7 years ago, and then it had been cleaned. Not perfectly, not chemically, just water and some physical abrasion, enough to remove the obvious, not enough to erase the cellular record, and wrapped in a cloth and placed in a bag with a burner phone and a false identity document and stored in the garage of a woman who had no idea it was there. Investigators now had the murder weapon. What they needed was a name. Lisette described David Park with the limited detail available to her. Male, early to mid-40s, medium build, unremarkable face, quiet manner, pleasant. Worked in mental health services. Had a truck. She thought it was gray, maybe silver. She'd never paid much attention. The burner phone in the bag was a dead end. It was wiped. The false ID bore a photograph of a man with a beard and glasses, neither of which Lisette recognized as matching David's appearance. It was a document prepared in anticipation of flight, not of regular use. Then someone thought to check the gas station security footage. Lisette had mentioned, in passing, in a follow-up interview 2 weeks after the initial discovery, that she had once driven past David in his truck at the gas station on County Road 18, approximately 2 miles from her house. She didn't know why she remembered it. She'd noticed him and waved, and he'd waved back. The gas station's owner had replaced his security system 8 months prior and was cooperative. Investigators reviewed footage from a 40-day window around Lisette's most recent contact with David. On the third day of the review, at 4:14 p.m. on a Thursday, they found a man in a gray pickup truck, waiting at the pump, wearing sunglasses, a gray jacket and a baseball cap. He pulled the cap low before getting out of the truck. He kept his face angled slightly down while he swiped his card and removed the pump handle. But when he walked around to the other side of the truck to check the tire pressure, the camera caught him from the front for approximately 3 seconds. 3 seconds was enough. Priya Mehta was in her car, parked outside a diner in downtown Millhaven, when her phone rang at 6:48 p.m. on a Thursday. She listened without speaking for most of the call. At one point she said, "Are you sure?" in a voice her colleague said did not sound like her voice. Then she said she'd be there in the morning. Then she ended the call. She sat in the parking lot for 11 minutes before she started the engine. She drove not to the office but to Birch Creek Road. She parked at the pull-off. She looked at the water. She sat there until it was completely dark. The arrest of Darian Ose Mensah was executed on the morning of April 19th at his home in Allegheny County. It was a quiet street, well-maintained houses, the kind of neighborhood where the garbage cans are brought in before dark and the lawns are cut on Saturdays. Priya drove herself. She had asked to be the lead on the door. He answered in a gray pullover sweater and socks. He looked at Priya and then at the 2 uniformed officers behind her, and something happened in his face that she had never seen in 5 years of sitting across from him. It went still. Not surprised. There was no moment of confusion, no instinctive flinch, no involuntary widening of the eyes that betrays genuine shock. Just stillness. The complete, managed stillness of a man who had been preparing somewhere in the back of his mind for this moment for years and had decided that when it came he would meet it with composure. "Give me a moment with that," he said, the phrase that he used in every meeting. The phrase that Priya had always heard as a small kindness, the signal that he was taking her seriously, that he was giving what she'd said the weight it deserved. She heard it differently now. She heard it as what it was, a control mechanism. A way of buying time. A phrase that had been so deeply embedded in his professional performance of thoughtfulness that it had become reflexive, even now, even here, with 3 people standing in his doorway with handcuffs. She read him his rights. He listened to every word with the same careful attention he had always given everything. He requested an attorney before she had finished. He made no further statements. The search of his home took 2 days. It was methodical and thorough, and documented to a standard that the lead evidence technician said she had rarely matched on any previous case. What they found was this: in a filing cabinet in the second-floor home office, locked with a key they found in the desk drawer, 3 manila folders containing printed documents related to the Oduya case. Not the official investigative materials that he had access to as a consultant. These were different. These included surveillance photographs, printed from a digital camera, judging by the resolution, of Marcus Feld at various locations, outside his apartment building, at the gas station where he worked, in the parking lot of the recreation center where the softball league had played. The photographs predated the murder. The earliest was time-stamped by the file metadata retrieved from Darian's computer 14 months before Celeste Oduya's death. He had been watching Marcus Feld for over a year before the murder. There were also printed transcripts, unofficial ones, made from a recording device that investigators eventually found hidden in a small decorative object on the bookshelf in the consultation room at the sheriff's office, where Darian had met with Priya every Tuesday for 5 years. He had been recording their meetings, every conversation about the arsons, the drowning, the stalking cases, every conversation about the Oduya case, every expression of doubt that Priya had allowed herself. All of it documented, stored, analyzed. The transcripts were annotated in his handwriting, notes in the margins, highlighting of specific passages, occasional question marks next to moments where Priya had pushed back on his framing. He had been managing their conversation with the same precision that a chess player manages the middle game. He knew every move she had made and every move she might make because he had been keeping the record. And there was the notebook. It was a standard composition notebook, black and white, spiral-bound, the kind that costs $2 at any office supply store. It was filled from cover to cover in Darian's distinctive, careful handwriting. It contained what could only be described, once the full contents were translated from clinical language, as a chronicle of obsession, beginning 18 months before the murder, when Darian had first encountered Celeste at the Pittsburgh conference, and extending to within a few weeks of his arrest. The early sections read as documentation of a relationship that existed, in any meaningful sense, only in his mind. He recorded their email exchanges with annotations, passing her words for hidden meaning, interpreting her eventual silence as interference rather than disinterest, cataloging what he described as the obstacles placed between them by circumstances, and by what he referred to in a recurring phrase as the misalignment of visibility. He wrote about her with a precision and an intimacy that were disturbing precisely because they were so controlled. No outbursts, no raw language, no howl of frustrated longing. Just the careful, measured documentation of a man who had constructed an entire parallel narrative of connection and was recording it as though it were fact. The section dated 8 months before the murder is the one that investigators spent the most time with. It is the section where the target shifts, where Darian's attention, having exhausted its focus on Celeste herself, turns outward, to the landscape of vulnerability around her, to the question of what happens after. He wrote about Marcus Feld for the first time in this section. He had identified Marcus through the softball league. Darian had apparently attended one of the recreational league games on a weekday evening following Celeste there. He had seen Marcus in the vicinity. He had done what he did professionally, habitually, almost instinctively he had assessed. He wrote, MF presents as socially peripheral, institutionally unsupported, locally embedded but without robust network, limited advocacy resources, history of conflict avoidance, moderate cognitive capacity with notable limitation in strategic reasoning, likely to be poorly served by legal process, proximal to victims' routine patterns, sufficient, that was the word he chose, not ideal, not perfect, sufficient. The prosecution's forensic psychology expert, Dr. Marguerite Adichie of the University of Pittsburgh, said in her trial testimony that this entry was the most revealing single document she had encountered in 20 years of forensic assessment. She said it demonstrated that the murder of Celeste Oduya was not an act of passion, not an impulsive response to rejection, not even a calculated act of retribution. It was, she said, something harder to categorize. It was the last step in a system of control. He had been unable to make Celeste part of his world through contact, through correspondence, through proximity. The murder was an act of possession, and the framing of Marcus Feld was an act of preservation of his own freedom, but also, I believe, preservation of the narrative. If someone else was guilty, the story became about her life, her death, the tragedy of a young woman taken by a disturbed young man. His role in it, his connection to her, his awareness of her, was erased. The story he had built about them became invisible, which in some sense made it safe, made it permanent, made it his. She paused and then she said, he couldn't have her, so he made sure no one else could have the truth about her either. The post-arrest investigation took 14 months to complete. It required the cooperation of 4 law enforcement agencies, a federal forensic database search, digital forensic specialists from the state AG's office, and the full resources of the Pennsylvania Innocence Project, which had taken up Marcus Feld's case as soon as the DNA match was announced publicly. Marcus had now served 6 years and 4 months. He was 29 years old. The formal exoneration hearing was held on a Thursday afternoon in May. Marcus Feld was represented by Claudette Moses, the public defender who had represented him at trial, and had, in the years since, continued to work his case without compensation on her own time, through 2 failed appeals and 1 petition that the state court had declined to consider. She described getting the call about the DNA match on a Friday afternoon. She said she sat down on the floor of her office. She said it took her a while to be able to dial Marcus's facility. She said that when she told him, there was a very long silence on the line, the kind of silence that has many things moving inside it at once. And then Marcus said simply, "I know." He had always known. He had said so to anyone who would listen for 6 years and 4 months. He had said it to guards and cellmates and visiting family and the chaplain, and in letters that he wrote with great care because writing did not come easily to him, to Claudette and to his mother Ruth and to anyone else whose address he had. He had said, "I didn't do this." Not as escalation, not as performance, but as a statement of fact, the way you state facts about yourself because they are true and because the alternative to stating them is to stop believing them. And he refused to stop believing them. Ruth Feld was waiting outside the facility when the doors opened. She was 61 years old. She had a sign on a piece of cardboard, the kind of sign that takes time to make, that is made slowly with intention, that said, "I always knew." When Marcus walked out of the facility and Ruth's arms went around him, there were cameras there. There were phones raised. The image that has been most widely reproduced shows very little. A blur of movement, 2 figures, the morning light behind them. What it shows is not something that belongs to anyone watching. But people looked anyway. They couldn't help it. Some of them said later that they wept. They said they weren't sure if it was joy or grief. It was probably both. It usually is. Deja Carmichael gave a statement through her attorney on the evening of Marcus's release. It was brief. It said, "I told the truth. I have always told the truth. I am glad he is free. I am sorry it took this long." Her attorney read it at a press conference. Deja was not present. Her attorney said she was not ready for questions. She has not spoken publicly since. Janelle Fortes, Celeste's roommate, the woman who had called in the missing persons report on that October morning, who had sat through the trial and believed, with the complete and genuine conviction of a person who loved Celeste and needed an explanation for what had happened to her, that Marcus Feld was the one responsible, gave a long interview to a Pittsburgh newspaper the year after the exoneration. She talked about what it meant to have been certain, about how the certainty had felt like loyalty, like the least she could do for Celeste was to be absolutely sure, about how that certainty had to be dismantled now, slowly and painfully, because it was built on something that wasn't real. She said she had sent Marcus a letter. She said she didn't know if he had read it. She said, "I don't know what I was seeing when I was sure. I think I was seeing someone to be sure about because the not knowing was unbearable and sure felt better than not knowing. But that's not the same as the truth. It looked like the truth. It had the weight of truth. It just wasn't." Walt Brzezinyak, who had waved goodbye to Celeste in the hallway on the last evening of her life, retired from Millhaven Middle School 4 years after the exoneration. He was 67. At the retirement party his colleagues threw for him in the school gymnasium, he gave a short speech he had written on a note card in his careful block handwriting. He said he thought about her sometimes, that he hoped she knew, wherever knowing happens, if it happens anywhere, that people had not forgotten, that they kept looking until they found it, that it took longer than it should have. He said, "She waved at me. At the end of the hallway, I can still see it." He folded the note card. He didn't say anything else. Several people in the room were crying by then. Walt was not one of them. He had done his crying years ago. The trial of Darian Osei-Mensah began 14 months after his arrest and lasted 11 weeks. It was, by the account of every journalist who covered it, one of the most methodically constructed prosecutions in the recent history of the Pennsylvania courts. The lead prosecutor, a woman named Elena Casares, who had been trying homicides for 19 years, said afterward that she had never prepared so thoroughly for a case and never felt so prepared to be surprised, because Darian's capacity for anticipating the moves of the people arrayed against him was the defining feature of everything he had done. The jury deliberated for 9 days. The verdict, when it came, was unanimous. First-degree murder, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, conspiracy to deprive a person of civil rights under color of professional authority, a charge that had been added late in the process, and that, in the opinion of several legal commentators, was the most apt description of what Darian had done. He had used his professional authority, his credentials, his position, his trusted access to the investigation, as the mechanism of the conspiracy, not as background, as the tool itself. On the day the verdict was read, Priya Mehta was in the courtroom. She had testified twice during the trial. She had been cross-examined for 3 hours on the second occasion by the defense attorney's most aggressive associate, who had pressed her repeatedly on the question of what she had known and when she had known it, and whether she had ignored warning signs. She had answered every question without deflection. She had said, under oath, that she had missed things, that she had been managed, that she had trusted a man whose proximity to the case she had never questioned because it served the investigation, or seemed to, and because he was good at his job and good at making you feel like your judgment in his presence was also good. She had said to a question about Deja Carmichael's unreturned phone call, "That was a failure. That was a failure of the investigation, and it was a failure of mine. I have no other way to say it." When the verdict was read, Priya felt, she said afterward, a period of whiteness, not relief, not the particular closing sensation she had experienced at the end of other cases, but something more like a held breath finally let out, followed by a cold that was still there underneath it. She left the courthouse alone. She drove to Millhaven. She drove down Route 9. She turned onto Birch Creek Road. She parked at the pull-off where Celeste's car had been found 11 years ago and sat there until the light was gone. She said she didn't know what she was doing there. She said she thought maybe she was trying to apologize, not to Celeste specifically, though that too, but to the case itself, to the shape of the truth that she had been close to for so many years without being able to reach it. She said she sat there and thought about all the Tuesdays, all the yellow legal pads and the black coffee and the careful voice and the head tilted thoughtfully to one side. She said she thought about how certain she had been, and how that certainty had been, in the end, a kind of cage, not one she was locked in from outside, one she had helped build, one beam at a time, convinced she was constructing something that would hold the truth, when actually she was constructing something that kept it out. "I wasn't just wrong," she said, in an interview given several months after the trial. "I was weaponized. There's a difference, and it took me a long time to understand it. He didn't just benefit from my mistakes, he designed them. He knew exactly what I would do with each piece of information because he knew me. He had been studying me the way he studied everything. And so in some ways, the better detective I was, the more thorough, the more careful, the more useful I was to him. My thoroughness was what made the wrongful conviction stick. It wasn't sloppiness that put Marcus in prison. It was me doing my job well, in a case that had been built to make my job lead somewhere wrong." She paused. "I don't know what to do with that. I've been thinking about it for 2 years, and I still don't know what to do with it. I think maybe you don't do anything with it. I think maybe you just carry it." The forensic psychology panel's assessment of Darian Osei Mensah, submitted as part of the sentencing record, is 63 pages long. Most of it is technical language, behavioral analysis, diagnostic frameworks. But there is one passage that the panel's lead author, Dr. Lena Ewan of the University of Pittsburgh, has said she spent longer on than any other. She wanted it to be accurate in a particular way. She wanted it to say something true about the mechanism, not just about Darian specifically, but about the class of danger he represented. The passage reads in part, "The subject's most instrumentally effective quality was not his intelligence, his clinical training, or his capacity for long-term strategic planning, significant as all of these were. It was his ability to replicate, with apparent authenticity, the experience of being understood. The individuals who worked most closely with the subject uniformly report that in his presence, they felt their own professional judgment to be at its sharpest, their own perceptions most validated, their own work most meaningful. This experience was not incidental to the conspiracy, it was the conspiracy. By making investigators feel maximally competent, he made them minimally vigilant. By seeming to share their commitment to truth, he became the person through whom their commitment to truth was most efficiently expressed. He was, in the precise sense, a false mirror." Dr. Yuen presented a version of this analysis at a conference on investigative psychology the following year. She said that the question the Osei Mensah case forced onto the field was one she couldn't answer cleanly. She said, "We talk about deception as a form of closing, locking the door, hiding the evidence, creating false alibis. But the most sophisticated form of deception is an opening. It presents itself as transparency, as collaboration, as the experience of being truly seen. And we are constitutionally ill-equipped to be skeptical of that experience because being seen is what we all want. It's what makes us trust. It's what makes us trust each other in order to do the work that requires trust. I don't know how you protect against it. I don't know that you can completely. I think you can only try to notice when the feeling of certainty is doing the work that evidence should be doing. And even then," she stopped and looked at her notes and then set them down. "Even then, Marcus Feld received a settlement from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania 2 years after his exoneration. The amount was not disclosed publicly, in accordance with the settlement terms. He moved to Pittsburgh. He enrolled in a paralegal certification program at a community college. His attorney, Claudette Moses, said in a brief statement that he was doing well and that he asked for privacy as he rebuilt his life. She said he had expressed interest, in time, in working with wrongful conviction organizations. She said she believed him when he said it. She said she had always believed him when he said things. Darian Osei Mensah is serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole at a state correctional facility in central Pennsylvania. He declined to make any statement at sentencing. He has not spoken publicly since his arrest. His published books remain in some university library collections, though several institutions have removed them or reclassified them. His consulting relationship with law enforcement agencies was formally terminated, obviously, though the termination was, in the technical language of the legal proceedings, somewhat moot, given the circumstance. The rubber glove trace on Celeste's wrist, documented in Dr. Sandra Kwan's original examination report, the one that was filed and not followed up on for 7 years, was matched during the post-arrest investigation to the specific type of examination glove that Darian kept in his home office. The brand was identifiable because the synthetic compound formulation was proprietary to one manufacturer. He had been wearing gloves when he stopped her on Birch Creek Road. He had been wearing them when he struck her. He had been wearing them when he carried her to the creek. And then he had taken them off, carefully, and left a thin trace of their surface on the wrist of the woman he had killed. It was in the file. It was in the file from the beginning. Dr. Kwan had written it down. Nobody had known what it meant until there was finally something to match it to. There is a particular kind of question that this case leaves behind, and it is not about procedure. Although the procedural failures are real and have been studied and documented, it is not about resources. Although the underfunding of the Millhaven Sheriff's Office is also real. It is not even about Priya Mehta, who carries what she carries and who was, in the most precise sense, a victim of the same intelligence that killed Celeste and imprisoned Marcus. The question is about trust, about what it is for and what it costs. Darian Osei Mensah understood something about human beings that most of us would prefer not to examine too closely, that we are navigable. That the desire to feel understood, to have someone across from us who seems to see what we see, who takes our work seriously, who makes us feel that our judgment is sharp and our instincts are good. That desire is so powerful and so fundamental that it can be manufactured and handed to us without our noticing the hand. That the feeling of being seen is its own kind of blindness. And he was not, in this, uniquely sinister. He had simply studied the mechanism and learned to operate it. The mechanism itself is not sinister. It is what makes it possible for people to work together, to trust each other, to share the burden of hard and necessary things. It is what makes investigations possible. What makes schools possible. What makes two strangers end up in a room together on a Thursday afternoon talking about a case that keeps one of them awake at night. Celeste Oduya was 26 years old. She noticed things. She made sentences do more work than they knew. On the last evening of her life, she waved at a man in a hallway, a full open-palmed wave like she meant it. She drove a 12-minute route home, along a road beside a creek in a river valley in western Pennsylvania, and someone was waiting for her, because he had studied where she would be and when she would be there. And he had studied her, and he had studied the world around her, and he had decided that her absence was the only form of proximity available to him. He was wrong about that too, as it turned out. The absence was not his. It never was. A 9-year-old boy found a rock behind some paint cans on a Tuesday afternoon in March, and the thread that ran between that moment and Celeste's careful attention to her students' work, between Theo's unsupervised curiosity and a dead young woman's gift for noticing, turned out to be stronger than everything Darian had constructed across a decade and a half of calculating, careful, brilliant darkness. He had planned for sophistication. He had not planned for a child with a bicycle pump and nowhere in particular to be. That gap, that small, cold, human gap between what we calculate and what simply happens, is where the truth was waiting. It is usually there somewhere, hidden behind something ordinary, waiting for someone to look, strange, dark, and in the end, against everything, a little bit like light.